We are often taught that a father's love is the ultimate shield against the world's cruelty. Yet, deep within the suffocating silence of ancient Thebes, there existed a devotion so twisted that it turned a protector into an executioner. Imagine looking into your father's eyes, seeking mercy, only to watch him tighten the final strip of linen across your living, breathing face. The year is 1230 BC. Beneath the colossal pillars of Karnak, the laws of Mayat, cosmic order, dictated that purity was worth more than blood. Here, High Priest ra-otep faced a terrifying choice: to save his daughter's life or to save her soul from eternal damnation. This is the true story of Nefaret. Before we descend into the tomb, ensure you are subscribed to our chronicles and tell me in the comments, from which city are you witnessing this darkness tonight? To truly understand the horror of the grave, we must first understand the suffocating brilliance of the life that preceded it. Imagine for a moment that you are Nefaret. You are 17 years old, and your world is not measured in miles or horizons, but in the cold, unyielding geometry of stone walls. The great temple of Karnak is not merely a building, it is a living, breathing beast of limestone and granite. A city within a city where the air itself feels heavy, with the scent of burning frankincense and the ancient dust of dynasties long past. While the common people of Thebes live their lives under the open, burning sun, fighting and loving and dying in the chaotic, vibrant streets by the Nile, you exist only in the shadows. You are the daughter of the High Priest ra-otep, and from the moment you drew your first breath, you were not a child. You were a vessel. History often forgets the terrifying weight of expectation placed upon the shoulders of the sacred. In the grand theological machinery of ancient Egypt, the purity of the priesthood was not a matter of personal choice, but a matter of national security. The texts from the era specifically, the instruction of Amenemope, remind us that the gods demand silence and perfection from those who serve them. If the vessel is cracked, the water of life leaks out and chaos ensues. Nefaret was raised on this doctrine. Her childhood was a series of rhythmic rituals designed to erase the individual self and replace it with a hollow perfection suitable for the gods. She was taught to walk without making a sound so as not to disturb the slumbering spirits of the sanctuary. She was taught to speak only in whispers, her voice a delicate instrument used solely for prayer, never for laughter, never for anger. Her father, ra-otep, was less a parent and more the architect of her cage. To the outside world, he was a figure of immense power, the intermediary between the mortal realm and the divine will of Amun. But to Nefaret, he was a distant statue carved from the same cold stone as the pillars that lined the hypostyle hall. We must be careful not to paint him simply as a villain, for in his own mind, he was a man of supreme virtue. He loved his daughter, not as a father loves a child, but as a sculptor loves his masterpiece. He had chiseled away her humanity year by year, polishing her soul, until he believed it reflected the divine light of the heavens. He did not see a girl who yearned for the touch of the wind or the taste of a sweet fig he saw an offering. And offerings, as any priest knows, must be kept pristine untouched by the profane hands of the world. The days in the temple were long and indistinguishable from one another. Morning began before dawn, with the ritual washing of the god statue, a ceremony performed in a silence so profound it made the ears ring. Nefaret would stand beside her father, holding the golden basin of water. Her hands steady, her eyes cast downward. She knew the layout of the floor tiles better than she knew the lines of her own palm. She knew the way the light shifted across the hieroglyphs as the sun climbed the sky, marking the passage of time in a place where time was supposed to stand still. But biology is a force even more potent than theology. Beneath the linen robes and the layers of sacred oils, a human heart still beat with a rhythm that no chant could fully suppress. It is here in the tension between the stone and the flesh that the tragedy begins to take root. We have recovered fragments of correspondence from this period, written by scribes who worked within the temple complex. And they speak of a peculiar atmosphere during the festival season of that year. They describe a tension in the air, a sense that the rigid order of Ma'at was being strained by unseen forces. For Nefaret, the temple was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a tomb with open doors. She began to steal glances through the narrow lattice windows that overlooked the outer courtyards. There she saw the swirl of life she was denied. She saw the merchants arguing over the price of grain, the children chasing stray dogs, the young lovers walking hand in hand by the riverbank, oblivious to the fact that they were being watched by a prisoner of the gods. This longing, this ache for the ordinary was her first transgression. It was a silent rebellion, a crack in the porcelain surface of her perfection. And it was through this crack that the world would eventually enter, bringing with it the seeds of her destruction. One must wonder what went through her mind during those long, lonely nights, when the temple was locked and the only sound was the distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of dry palm leaves. Did she pray for strength to remain pure? Or did she, in the secret chambers of her heart, pray for something forbidden? Did she pray to be tainted? The turning point came not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. A young scribe named Kimu, whose duty was to copy the sacred inventories, had been granted access to the inner courtyard to repair a damaged scroll. He was a man of ink and papyrus, not of blood and lineage, but he possessed something that the high priest ra-otep did not. He possessed eyes that saw Nefaret not as a vessel, but as a woman. Their interaction was brief, a violation of protocol that should have been impossible under the watchful gaze of the temple guards. Perhaps a dropped scroll, perhaps a shared glance across a pool of lotus flowers. History does not record the exact mechanism of their meeting, but it records the catastrophic consequence. In a world built on absolute control, the slightest deviation is an act of war against the gods. And for Nefaret, that brief stolen moment was the first breath of air she had taken in 17 years. A breath that would ultimately cost her the ability to breathe at all. The architecture of forbidden love in ancient Egypt was not built upon moonlight and poetry, but upon the terrifying thrill of espionage. We must strip away the modern romanticism that Hollywood imposes on history and look at the reality of Nefaret's situation. She was effectively a prisoner of state, and her interactions with the scribe Kimu were not merely illicit trysts. They were acts of high treason against the spiritual order. The temple complex of Karnak was a labyrinth of surveillance where the eyes of fellow priestesses and the ears of eunuch guards were always open. To exchange a word or a token was to risk not just expulsion, but a fate far worse than death. Yet the human spirit has a perverse tendency to seek warmth precisely where the cold is most absolute. The records tell us that the scribes of the temple had access to the inner sanctums only at specific hours, usually to catalogue the tributes of gold and grain that flowed into Thebes from the conquered lands of Nubia and the Levant. It was during these brief windows of bureaucratic necessity that the contamination occurred. It began with a dropped reed brush, a seemingly clumsy accident that allowed two hands to brush against one another for a fraction of a second. In that microscopic moment, the barrier between the divine and the mortal was breached. We can imagine the shock that must have coursed through Nefaret's body, a jolt of electricity that felt more sacred than any prayer she had ever recited. It was the shock of recognition, the sudden realization that she was not merely a statue of flesh and blood, but a woman capable of desire. Over the following weeks, The infection of affection spread through the shadowed corridors. They did not speak in long sonnets, but in broken, hurried whispers, hidden beneath the noise of the temple work. Kimu, risking his life, smuggled small tokens to her, not gold or jewels, which would have been detected immediately, but things of no value to the gods, yet priceless to a girl who had never lived. A rough sketch of a bird on a scrap of papyrus, a small clay amulet of Hathor, the goddess of joy and motherhood, a deity whose chaotic vitality was the antithesis of the rigid, sterile order of Amun. Nefaret hid these treasures in the folds of her linen robes, pressing them against her skin, as if to absorb the freedom they represented. She began to live a double life, performing the rituals of the day with mechanical precision, while her mind wandered to the forbidden world outside the gates. But secrets in a closed system like Karnak are like rot in a granary. They cannot remain hidden forever. The atmosphere in the temple began to shift. The other priestesses, who had once looked upon Nefaret with envy, now looked at her with suspicion. They sensed a change in her energy, a distraction in her prayers, a subtle flush on her cheeks that the sacred oils could not explain. Paranoia is a powerful contagion, and soon the whispers reached the highest echelons of the priesthood. It is here that we see the tragedy of ra-otep fully form. He was a man who prided himself on his omniscience within the temple walls. Yet he was the last to see the truth of his own daughter. When the rumors finally reached him, brought by a trembling servant who feared the wrath of the gods less than the wrath of the high priest, he did not explode in anger. He went still. It was the stillness of a predator that has realized its own nest has been defiled. The discovery was inevitable and brutal. A routine inspection of the priestess's quarters, ostensibly to ensure ritual purity, turned up the damning evidence. Under a loose stone in the floor of Nefaret's chamber, they found the scrap of papyrus with the sketch of the bird. It was innocent enough to modern eyes, but in the context of the temple, it was a smoking gun. It was proof of a connection to the outside world, proof of an attachment that had not been sanctioned by the divine will. The guards were summoned, not with shouts, but with hand signals. Nefaret was taken from her bed in the dead of night, her mouth covered before she could scream a precaution not to silence her, but to prevent her impure breath from further contaminating the holy air. Now we enter the third chapter of this nightmare, the Tribunal of Shadows. We must understand that this was not a trial in any recognizable legal sense. There was no defense attorney, no jury of peers, no presumption of innocence. This was a theological inquiry, a diagnostic procedure to determine the extent of the rot. The chamber where they took her was deep beneath the main temple complex, a room used for the storage of old ritual tools and broken statuary. The air here was stale and cold, heavy with the smell of dust and ancient secrets. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like demons waiting to be fed. Ra-otep sat on a simple wooden stool, his face a mask of terrifying neutrality. He did not look like a father looking at a wayward child. He looked like a surgeon looking at a gangrenous limb. The scribe Kimu had already been dealt with. History does not record his fate, but we can assume it was swift and likely involved the crocodiles of the Nile, a standard disposal method for those who touched what belonged to the gods. But for Nefaret, the punishment had to be more complex. She was not just a person, she was a consecrated vessel. To simply kill her would be to release her impure soul into the afterlife, where it might offend the gods in the field of reeds. The theological problem facing ra-otep was how to contain the pollution, how to neutralize the threat she posed to the cosmic order of Ma'at. The dialogue of that night, if we can call it dialogue, was one-sided. Ra-otep spoke of duty, of the fragility of the universe, and of the burden of the chosen. You were the bride of Amun, he said, his voice devoid of inflection. You were the anchor that held the sky above the earth. By breaking your vow, you have not merely sinned against yourself, you have risked the collapse of the world. This sounds like madness to us, like the rantings of a fanatic. But we must remember that to the ancient Egyptians, this was literal truth. They believed that the sun only rose because the rituals were performed perfectly. By introducing human desire into the equation, Nefaret had threatened the sunrise itself. Nefaret, kneeling on the cold stone, trembling in her thin night shift, tried to speak. She tried to appeal to the man who had once carried her on his shoulders, who had taught her the names of the stars. "Father," she whispered, "I only wanted to live." But the word father seemed to slide off him like water off oil. In that room, under the flickering torchlight, ra-otep had successfully killed the father within himself. He was now only the high priest, the instrument of divine judgment. He looked at her and saw not his flesh and blood, but a cracked vessel that needed to be sealed. The verdict was delivered with the bureaucratic efficiency of a tax assessment. The council of elders, who stood in the shadows behind ra-otep, nodded in agreement. The law of Ma'at demanded restoration. The impurity could not be washed away with water, it had to be contained. The sentence was not death, for death implies a release of the spirit. The sentence was the living seal. She was to be mummified, not after she died, but while the life still flickered within her. The logic was terrifyingly consistent. By wrapping her body in the sacred linen and sealing it with the holy resin while she was still alive, they would trap her soul inside her body. She would be denied the afterlife, denied the judgment of Osiris, denied existence itself. She would simply cease to be a problem. She would become an object, a sealed jar of sin buried deep within the earth, where it could never leak out again. The cruelty of this sentence is almost impossible to comprehend. It required a suppression of empathy so total that it borders on the psychopathic, yet it was framed as an act of mercy. Ra-otep told her that this was the only way to save her from being devoured by Amit the Soul Eater in the afterlife. By keeping her soul trapped in her body, he was technically sparing her from total oblivion. It was a twisted logic, a horrific rationalization that allowed him to commit filicide while believing he was performing a sacrament. As the guards stepped forward to drag her toward the preparation chamber, Nefaret did not scream. She went limp, her mind perhaps unable to process the enormity of the betrayal. She looked at her father one last time, searching for a crack in the mask, a tear in the eye. But there was nothing, only the cold judgment of stone. And as the heavy wooden doors of the tribunal chamber creaked shut, the sound echoed like the slamming of a coffin lid, marking the end of her life as a human being, and the beginning of her eternity as a prisoner of the dark. The journey from the tribunal to the preparation chamber was a descent into the underworld, not metaphorically, but physically. The Wabet, or the place of purification, was located deep within the temple foundations, designed to be cool enough to slow the decomposition of bodies while the priests performed their 70-day ritual. But tonight, there would be no 70-day wait. Tonight the process would be accelerated. The air in the chamber was thick enough to taste. A cloying mixture of natron salt cedar oil and the overwhelming metallic tang of molten resin. It is a smell that sticks to the back of the throat, a smell that signifies the boundary between the living and the eternal. Nefaret was placed upon the stone embalming table not by guards, but by the mute servants of the necropolis men, whose tongues had been removed so they could never speak of the secrets of the dead. The stone was cold against her skin, a shocking contrast to the feverish heat of her terror. She was not bound with ropes. There was no need. The sheer paralyzing weight of the situation, the presence of her father, the chanting of the priests, the encroaching shadows, held her down more effectively than any chain. She lay there, staring up at the ceiling, where painted stars flickered in the torchlight, realizing with a detached horror that these were the last stars she would ever see. Then the wrapping began. We must understand that mummification was not merely a physical process, it was a magical cocooning. The linen bandages were inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, intended to protect the limbs from injury in the afterlife. But as the priests began to wind the strips of cloth around Nefaret's feet, they were not protecting her, they were erasing her. Round and round the linen went a rhythmic swishing sound. Swish, 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 like the scythe of a harvester cutting down wheat. They bound her ankles together, fusing her legs into a single pillar. They wrapped her fingers individually, then bound the hands to her chest in the pose of Osiris. With every layer, the world receded a little further. The sensation was not of pain, but of a terrible constricting pressure. A hug that would never end. Ra-otep stood at the head of the table, reciting the spells of binding. Sam, his voice did not waver. You are bound to the west. He chanted, you are sealed against the east. The mouth of the grave is open to receive you, but the mouth of the world is closed. He was reciting the liturgy of protection, but in this context, it became a liturgy of imprisonment. When the bandages reached her chest, Nefaret's breathing became shallow. The linen was tight, compressing her ribs, forcing her lungs to work harder for every thimbleful of air. She tried to catch her father's eye one last time, to scream without sound, to beg for the childhood that had been stolen from her. But he was looking past her, looking at the wall, looking at the gods, looking anywhere, but at the daughter he was murdering. And then came the resin. In traditional mummification, resin is used to seal the body against moisture and bacteria, a final layer of preservation. The priest brought forward the jars of black aromatic liquid, heated until it was viscous like honey. They did not pour it over her face. That would be too quick, too merciful. They poured it over the bandages on her body. The heat was intense, soaking through the layers of cloth, warming her skin with a false comfort before it began to cool and harden. The smell of the myrrh was overpowering, filling her nose, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. The resin seeped into the weave of the linen, turning the soft cloth into a hard shell. She was being encased in a statue of her own making. The final moment, the moment that haunts the nightmares of anyone who hears this story, came when they prepared the head. They did not wrap her mouth immediately. They left her face exposed until the very end, perhaps, to witness the light leaving her eyes. Ra-otep stepped forward. He held a strip of fine linen dipped in the sacred oil. He leaned down, and for a brief second, his mask slipped. His hand trembled. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, a gesture of tenderness, so jarringly out of place that it felt more cruel than the knife. "Forgive me," he whispered. But he was not asking for her forgiveness, he was asking for the gods. Then with a swift, practiced motion, he placed the cloth over her mouth and nose. Darkness, not the darkness of night which promises dawn, but the darkness of the void. The sound of the world was muffled, instantly reduced to a dull roar. Nefaret gasped, but the cloth was tight. She inhaled the scent of oil and dust. Her chest heaved against the hardening shell of resin. But there was nowhere to expand. The panic that set in was primal, absolute. It was the biological imperative of every living thing to fight for air. But she was fighting against stone, against linen, against the will of a father who had decided she was already dead. The last thing she felt was the vibration of footsteps walking away. Then the heavy, grinding sound of a stone sarcophagus lid sliding into place. And then Silence. A silence that would last for 3,000 years. Time is a cruel narrator. It erases civilizations. It turns temples into dust, and it turns tragedies into mysteries. Thebes fell. The Assyrians came then. The Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. The name of ra-otep was forgotten. The location of the Wabe was lost under shifting sands. The screams of Nefaret were swallowed by the earth, leaving no echo. Or so it seemed. But history has a way of vomiting up its secrets when we least expect it. Fast forward to the year 1889, the Victorian era, an age of obsession with death and the exotic. British archaeologists in tweed suits and pith helmets were scouring the Nile Valley, driven by a hunger for gold and glory. Among them was a man named Arthur Weigel, a meticulous excavator who was less interested in treasure and more interested in the anomalies of the past. His team was digging in a previously unexplored sector of the Karnak complex, a place the locals avoided calling it the place of the weeping shadows. They found a sealed door, not the grand entrance of a royal tomb, but a modest service door hidden behind a false wall. The seal remained unbroken, indicating that no grave robber had entered in millennia. When they broke the seal, the air that rushed out was stale and dry. Breath of the 19th dynasty. Inside, they found no gold, no jewelry, no Ushabti figures meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife. They found only a single plain sarcophagus shoved into the corner as if in shame. There were no inscriptions on the lid, no name, no prayer to Osiris. It was an anonymous box for an anonymous soul. When they pried the lid open, the sight that greeted them caused seasoned men to recoil in horror. This was not the serene repose of a pharaoh, arms crossed peacefully over the chest. This was a scene of struggle frozen in time. The mummy was twisted. The legs were drawn up slightly as if the person had tried to kick against the lid. The arms were not crossed in the traditional Osirian pose, but were tense hands clawing at the wrappings. But it was the face that silenced the room. The jaw was wide open, locked in a rictus of eternal screaming. The head was thrown back, the neck muscles taut, even under the bandages. It was the face of someone who had looked into the abyss and found it staring back. Weigel noted in his journal, "This is not a burial. This is a crime scene." In the years that followed, forensic science began to catch up with archaeology, allowing us to peer beneath the wrappings without unwrapping the body. Modern CT scans of this screaming woman revealed anomalies that chilled the medical experts. The first anomaly was the heart. In traditional mummification, the heart is left in place, but the other internal organs are removed. In this case, the lungs and stomach were still inside, desiccated but present. This suggests a haste that violated all ritual protocol. But the most damning evidence was the position of the jaw and the contraction of the muscles. Pathologists call it cadaveric spasm, a rare form of rigor mortis that occurs when death is instantaneous and violent, usually accompanied by extreme emotional trauma or physical exertion. It captures the final moment of life, preserving the body in the exact posture of its death throes. Nefaret had not died peacefully on the embalming table. She had died fighting for breath, fighting against the darkness. The resin patterns on her skin showed that the liquid was applied while the chest was still expanding, confirming the impossible. She was mummified while her heart was still beating. But the final piece of the puzzle, the emotional anchor that ties this forensic horror back to the human tragedy, was found not on the body, but on the wall of the tomb itself. It was a detail missed by the initial excavators, hidden in the shadows near the floor. A faint scratching in the limestone, barely visible under the torchlight. It was not a formal hieroglyph carved by a master mason. It was a crude scrawl, scratched perhaps with a chisel, or a sharp stone by a hand that was shaking. It read simply, Armai Entiarit, HW. It was a confession, a final secret graffiti left by ra-otep after the other priests had left after the torches were extinguished. The high priest had returned to the scene of his crime. He had stood there in the dark, listening to the silence, realizing that his devotion to Ma'at had cost him his soul. He had not saved his daughter, he had damned himself. That scratching on the wall is the only epitaph Nefaret ever received. A testament to a regret that came too late to save her, but just in time to haunt him forever. In the end, the story of Nefaret is not merely a ghost story from the banks of the Nile, nor is it simply a curiosity for the glass cases of a museum. It is a mirror held up to the face of humanity. A mirror that reflects a terrifying truth about the nature of evil. We often like to imagine that monsters are creatures of darkness born of malice and hate. But the tragedy of the high priest ra-otep teaches us something far more unsettling. It teaches us that the most horrific acts are often committed not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. Ra-otep did not hate his daughter. In his twisted reality, he saved her. He believed so completely in the dogmas of his time that he was willing to sacrifice the only thing he truly loved to uphold an abstract concept of purity. He is a reminder that when faith is stripped of compassion, when ideology is placed above humanity, we become capable of unspeakable things. The linen strips that bound Nefaret were woven from piety. The resin that suffocated her was poured with reverence. It was a holy murder, a sanctified atrocity. Today the ruins of Karnak stand silent under the Egyptian sun. The chants of the priests have long faded, and the gods they served have crumbled into dust. But if you walk through the hyper-style hall, when the wind blows from the west, some say you can still hear a sound that does not belong to the desert. It is not the wind, it is a gasp. A sharp, desperate intake of breath from a girl who was denied her life by the very people who gave it to her. The screaming mummy remains in the Cairo Museum, a permanent testament to the cost of silence. Her open mouth is no longer screaming for air. It is screaming for us to remember. It warns us that the line between a protector and an executioner is thinner than a strip of linen, and it forces us to ask ourselves a question that echoes from the dark corners of the 19th dynasty straight into our modern lives. We look back at ra-otep with horror, judging him for his barbarism. But are we so different? How many times in our own history, in our own societies, have we sacrificed the vulnerable on the altar of the greater good? How many times have we looked away when the impure were silenced, simply because the rules said it was necessary? Nefaret died in the dark, but her truth has finally found the light. She was not a sinner. She was not a vessel. She was a girl who loved, and for that, she paid the ultimate price. As you lay your head down tonight in the safety of your room, take a moment to listen to the silence. Is it truly peaceful, or is it merely the sound of a world that is waiting, watching, and remembering? Sleep well.